Welcome everyone, and thank you for bearing with me tonight in my teaching and for going online for this class. Let's go ahead and start as we usually do with a few prayers. Just going to recite this praise to Shakyamuni Buddha once together in English, and then we'll go on to do the two additional prayers. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. And we'll do the short mandala offering. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And then refuge and bodhicitta the first time. We'll do it in English, and then we'll recite the Tibetan twice. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kapsu Chi Daki Chanyen Gipe Sonam Gi Dola Penchir Sangye Drupal Sho Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyabsu Chi Daki Chanyen Gipe Sonam Gi Dola Penchir Sangye Drupal Sho. Let's do a short meditation. To spend the first few minutes focusing on the breath, using whatever technique you prefer to use with the breath. And then I will come in and lead you in a short reflection to set our motivation of bodhicitta. So we can begin the meditation now. So now to set our motivation for tonight, let's reflect briefly on a topic I covered last Wednesday, which was what we call the four seals. These are these four kind of facts that every Buddhist should ideally be putting forward in terms of how they see things philosophically, how we look at the world that we live in, what our situation is, and of course, the hope for there to be something that is other than this. The very first of these four seals is that everything that is compounded, that arises from causes and conditions, is in the nature of impermanence. And this is to wake us up to that reality of not just the gross impermanence that we experience through having to confront death and so on, but the subtle impermanence, everything constantly changing, not staying the same for even a moment, all of our conditioned world in this state of impermanence. And of course, with that is some unsatisfactoriness because things are impermanent. There's nothing we can rely on in a definitive way in regard to the world that we live in. All of our pleasures are transitory and fleeting. This is the nature of our existence. And secondly, the seal that the phenomena that are contaminated, meaning that they are arising together with the causes of this state of existence, especially our ignorance, are all unsatisfactory, are all in the nature of suffering. This again is the very first noble truth that the Buddha taught, that we're living in an unsatisfactory state. To open our eyes to that reality so that we then seek to have something other than this conditioned existence under the control of our delusions, especially our ignorance, creating karma, causes us to have the variety of experiences in samsara. We have to see this for what it is, that it is unsatisfactory, that it is dukkha, suffering. And the third topic, which we're examining in this course to a large degree, is that all phenomena are selfless, meaning that they don't have some way of existing that we are imagining, that we are creating through the force of our ignorance. As we've seen already in last week's class, there are different ways that this selflessness is posited. But this is the key. This is the way in which we unravel samsara, is by knowing things as they actually are, coming to see their selflessness. And then finally, the fourth seal, that nirvana is peace. By doing that unraveling, by removing the causes of us being in samsara, we can attain this peaceful state of nirvana, a state in which we will no longer be under the control of our karma and delusions, no longer experiencing suffering nature of samsara, no longer having to be in any way damaged by the fact of impermanence. This is complete transition that we all can attain into the state of peace, nirvana, freedom. So again, these four seals are what signifies us being Buddhist in terms of our philosophical point of view. And they feed into our motivation, because when we hold those four seals, we then initially desire that state of nirvana for ourselves, a wish to know selflessness and to be able to be free of what causes our own samsara, our own unsatisfactory experience. But in the Mahayana, we want to expand our motivation to recognize that all beings who are in samsara are also dealing with the same facts, the impermanence of conditioned things, the unsatisfactory nature of those things that are contaminated by ignorance, and not seeing the selflessness of things, and therefore are continuing to have that experience. But it need not be so. They too can attain the peace of nirvana, the peace that eventually ripens into full Buddhahood. So we ourselves dedicate once more to achieving our own enlightenment so we can lead others to attaining that same state, recognizing that they're in the same predicament as ourselves. And we generate that motivation so that our further investigation tonight, particularly of the Mahayana schools of thought, will be fruitful for us, help us to attain our deepest potential, so we then can help others perfectly. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes fully, and we'll begin. So again, in last week's class, and I once more have to give the caveat that we're trying to cram a whole lot of information into 2 single sessions of 90 minutes each. So I'll do my best tonight to cover some of the topics, at least the highlights of things. Know that you do have these handouts that go into a little more detail. But last week we did introduce the whole topic of tenets, Buddhist philosophical thinking, and how it's structured in terms of these 4 schools. Again, last week we were able to look at least to some degree at the Vaibhashika school and a little bit at the Sautrantika school. These are what are called the Hinayana schools. And remember that the Hinayana schools are simply following these lower tenets that aren't examining things as deeply as the Mahayana schools that we're going to look at tonight. Nonetheless, they do make some assertions. And the main things that we've been looking at in this course are 2 subjects. The first is the 2 truths. The idea that the Buddha taught in every one of these philosophical systems some way of delineating what is a conventional truth versus what is an ultimate truth. And each school has a different way of positing that. Let's take a look at what we examined last time in terms of that one chart that you have. I think it's this one here, yeah, that talks about how Vaibhashika is very much in that kind of realist category. As I said last week, probably the materialist view of our scientists who still practice that kind of view of things is probably closest to this. Conventional truth for them is a phenomenon such that if it were broken or mentally separated into parts, the mind that is apprehending that object would cease. So an example is like a vase or a piece of cloth or whatever. If you shatter the vase with a hammer, well then you can't have a consciousness knowing the vase any longer because it is destroyed. Ultimate truth, on the other hand, is a phenomenon that is such that if it were broken or mentally separated into parts, the mind apprehending that object would not cease. And this gets down into what they call directionally partless particles, which, as I mentioned last week, I don't know that it's identical to what scientists are examining in the microscopic world of going further and further into quarks and subquarks and what have you, trying to find the very basic elements and particles of which all of our physical things consist of, and well as temporally partless moments of consciousness, saying that even time can only be divided down into particular partless moments. And these, again, can be refuted relatively easily, but nonetheless, this is the view that this school is holding. They're kind of the furthest away from the higher views of what is reality, what is the nature of things. When it comes to Sautrantika, I was touching on this a little bit at the end of last week. Again, we didn't have so much time to devote to this school. But we see that conventional truth there is a phenomenon that is unable to perform a function ultimately. This is referring to things that are permanent. I didn't talk about this so much, but essentially, when we introduce this idea of our conceptual mind is knowing things through a kind of a medium of a mental image. So when I ask you to think about the color of the sky, or the sound of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, the opening movement, or whatever it is, I ask you to conjure up something in your conceptual mind. You're always working with a mental image that is not the actual object. In this category, we're starting to move into the understanding that conventional truth has some nature of concealing how things are. And even with the conceptual mind, we do have that idea. The conventional truths are only those phenomena that are known in that way, that are kind of a permanent, unchanging phenomenon, because these images that arise in our minds are said to be permanent, unchanging. If I mentioned last week the idea of asking you to think about the face of your mother of this life, whoever it was that played that role for you, whether it was your birth mother or not, you can bring that image to mind, but it's very much an unchanging image. Yeah, it might be one of the last times that we saw our mother, and we're kind of bringing that to mind, a sort of snapshot, if you will. This is what these mental images are said to be, is kind of unchanging, permanent phenomena. Whereas if your mother was actually here in front of you and you were seeing her, that would be an impermanent phenomenon. Her physical body that is constantly changing right there can be directly known through your eye consciousness and so on. So what we have in this second school is a delineation of the two truths in terms of what consciousness is knowing them and the phenomena that are being known. If it's something that is permanent and unchanging, it becomes a conventional truth. And there's a bit of a concealing going on there because we are unable to know all the richness of detail of that object by virtue of it being seen and known through this mental image. Whereas if our eye consciousness is actually seeing our mother of this life in front of us, the richness of detail of her face, all the various colors and textures and shape and so on, all of that is appearing vividly to the mind without any sort of medium between the object and the consciousness knowing it. That becomes an ultimate truth for them. Again, it's kind of not the way that we think about the higher schools at all, as we're going to see tonight. But this kind of sets the stage for what we are actually going to be moving away from. There's still an involvement, definitely, with consciousnesses and how consciousnesses are knowing objects. Let me put on the screen the one handout that had these 5 points that were being made at the very end there. It says there, in a great many ways, the study of Geluk presentation of the sutra system prepares the mind for the study, especially of the middle way system. This is the highest system. We'll be looking at that last tonight. And I'll just point out the main points here. First, the sutra system introduces the idea that the two truths are the objects of two distinct types of awareness: conceptual consciousnesses and direct perceivers. So again, we have this idea, and especially it's taken to its culmination in the middle way school, that the way that things are known in a conventional manner through our thought consciousnesses and so on, and even what we know through our senses to some degree, those become all of what we mean by conventionalities, conventional truth. Whereas what we know directly, especially through the highest direct perception, which is what we call yogic direct perception, this is what we mean by ultimate truth, is the emptiness that can be known, the selflessness that can be known by that. We'll get into that a little bit later tonight. So we're setting the stage for the idea that you have some phenomena that are accessible only to a direct perception, such as emptiness in terms of their richness and vividness. And then we have many other phenomena that are dependent upon our conceptuality to even establish their existence. This is where we're going to be heading to in terms of this final view of the middle way school, particularly the consequence middle way school. Let's go on to the next one, the second point that's there. Second, the sutra system is the context in which Gelugpas introduced students to the idea that conceptuality, far from being the enemy, is an absolutely indispensable tool on the path to liberation. We see this in the higher presentations, is that we have to learn about emptiness, selflessness through our conceptuality, and then eventually it can be known directly. But conceptuality is a necessary part of our path. And so remember the Satrantika school, how they realize their selflessness or their emptiness. I'll talk about what that is in a moment, just to review, because again, those are still valid points for the higher schools. We see that we know it initially through a conceptual mind that understands how things are selfless, understands that they lack a particular way of existing. And eventually in the Sautrantika school, that is known, but it is known in a very strange way, because that selflessness is a concept. It is a permanent phenomenon. It is known through our conceptual mind in that manner. It can never be known directly by even a yogic direct perception. This is one of the things that is unique to this school. It says that we actually know it indirectly by knowing the five aggregates, the mind and body that the person is based on, we can come to understand the selflessness of that person. So let's talk about these selflessnesses right now before we go on. Remember that there were two selflessnesses that were set forward. I want to put this one on here. Here we're looking at these two boxes here under selflessness of persons. We're within the Vaibhashika and Sautrantika school, but these do extend down all the way through even one of the middle way schools. The coarsest one, is the non-existence of a permanent, partless, independent person. Remember, this is the idea of like an Atman or a soul. And I'm not going to go into the whole review of that, but that is a very coarse idea that we even have to be introduced to in order to hold that view, but then that can be refuted relatively easily. The one that is realized in this manner that I was just talking about for Sautrantika is the second one, the non-existence of a self-sufficient, substantially existent person, which, remember, we talked about that last week as being like a controller, like the head salesperson of a sales department. We have this view of a self that abides among the aggregates, the mind and the body, but is not equivalent to them. It's the one that's in charge. That's why we often think my body, my mind, and so on. So again, this is a coarser view than what Prasangika Madhyamika sets forward. But for all the schools that were in that chart, they hold that that is what needs to be abandoned in order to achieve liberation. So for Sautrantika in particular, they do realize that, but they don't realize it in a direct manner because it's a permanent phenomenon. For them, that's permanent phenomena are conventional truths. The only thing that can be known by direct perception are ultimate truths. So for them, even selflessness is not an ultimate truth, which is kind of strange. But this is the whole hierarchy that we're looking at. Each school going a little bit further in terms of how do they define what is ultimate, what is conventional. What is it that is realized at this deeper level that is the means of attaining liberation? But the point that was being made in that handout that I just showed you a few minutes ago was that conceptuality is what helps you to get there. If you don't use the conceptual mind to investigate, to analyze, you can never get to any of these deeper states of existence, nirvana, Buddhahood, what have you. So it's dependent, contingent upon conceptuality, even though conceptuality has its problems. Again, it's using these mental images that are not the actual object. Let me just point out I think there were three other points that had to do with that kind of what Sautrantika teaches us about the middle way school in particular. Point three, third, the sutra system equalizes the status of parts and wholes in contrast to the Vaibhashika, the great exposition system. Again, remember, they're looking at wholes being conventional truths, the ultimate truths being these partless parts that are down there at the deepest level. So again, we're kind of moving away from a materialist point of view and holding parts and wholes to have equal status. Number four, the sutra system helps to prepare the mind for the study of the middle way system by introducing the idea that something can exist even though it is just imputed by conceptuality. Again, selflessness is an example, right? Selflessness is something that we can know through our conceptual mind. For Sautrantika, it is not an ultimate truth, but nonetheless, it does exist. Things that are known conventionally do have a status of being existent. There is still some falsity going on in the way conceptuality is knowing them, but they are established as existing. And this is a theme that we're going to see going forward into the Mahayana schools that we're going to look at shortly, is that we have these two modes of knowing things, but they are equally involved in determining what is valid. They might have their errors. Conceptuality does have problems, but it doesn't mean that it has no ability to validate what exists. It does validate certain things. So again, this is something we're going to see a little bit more tonight. And then finally, number five, the sutra system insists that things can work, meaning carry out functions, act as causes, only if they exist in an ultimate sense from their own side, and not just as imputations by conceptuality. That's because everything that is known by our direct senses and so on is ultimate truth for them. This assertion, as it says here, which is utterly contrary to the view of the middle way consequence system, is like a target that Gelukpa teachers set up in the minds of their students. It draws an aspect of our innate worldly way of thinking out of the shadows and into the focus of awareness. Later, when the study of the middle way system is taken up, the arguments of that higher system will already have a clear target at which to aim and strike. So the idea here is that, again, things that are merely imputed by the mind that have this status can still function. Things can be functional within the context of what we're going to see, especially in the middle way school. So there isn't this delineation of if it's functional and something that we can know through our direct sense consciousness and so on, then that's ultimately real, versus if it's something that the conceptual mind thinks up, then that has no valid status at all. Rather, we're able to hold all of this, something that is very contrary to that, saying that everything, even that is established by conceptuality, which, as we're going to see with Prasangika and Yamaka, is everything. Conceptuality is involved in the establishment of everything that exists. And it has an ability to do that. It doesn't mean that we've negated it or functionalities or anything. We are able to uphold that things that are merely imputed can still exist and can still function. And we don't need to have that type of a delineation. Instead, with the two truths, it's going to be delineated much differently. So this is what we looked at a bit last week, and adding a little bit more explanation on. Let's go ahead and move on. I know well, let me just check in. Kind of nervous about opening it up to questions because we're only a half hour in. We still have a bit of material to go through. But were there any points that need to be clarified before we move on to the Mahayana schools? These two lower schools are really kind of tough because, especially if we came in studying the Prasangika Nyamika point of view, you look at them and they just don't make sense. Just like, what are you talking about? Because they really are putting so much more into the objective existence, so much more confidence into things having their own nature apart from the mind. What we're going to see as we move into the Mahayana schools is that the mind becomes much more central. Mind is involved to some degree in the first two schools because, again, it's to a mind that either the partless particles or the conglomerates of those are appearing in the Vaibhashika school, and it's also to a mind that conventional truths and ultimate truths are being posited in regard to Sautrantika. But the primacy of the mind is not really being established yet. When we get into the mind only and the middle way schools, these next two schools, we see how mind begins to take even more of a role. In this next one, which is usually called mind only or Chitta Matra, this is where we see that mind is said to be really quite involved because it's only through the force of the imprints that are on the mind that cause various karmic appearances to occur. This school is known for establishing that essentially there are no external objects. Let me explain this a little bit more before we actually take a look at this school and kind of go into a little bit more detail. The Buddha often used the example of a dream and dream objects to talk about how things lack some deeper way of existing. The mind-only school is going to interpret that almost literally. If we look at our dreams, when we are dreaming, I don't know your dreams. I only know my own dreams, but I assume yours are similar. You are having this experience of having things appear to your consciousness that seem as real as your waking life. That's why we can have a lot of emotions in our dreams. We might wake up very frightened from a dream or quite enticed by something that we saw, a place we went to, what have you. All of these can arise because we instill in our dream objects a level of reality that is not actually there. We know that because we wake up from our dreams at some point in the night or in the morning. We wake up and we go, oh, that was just a dream. All those wonderful objects or scary objects or whatever it was that were appearing, they don't exist. They were just kind of coming from within my dream awareness, my mental consciousness that was in that state of sleep and dreaming. Mind only really takes that quite literally and says that that is even what is happening in our waking state. Most of you have seen the movie The Matrix. One of my Buddhist friends, after seeing The Matrix, said, wow, that's really about emptiness. But as I thought about it, I thought it's really not, it's really mind only emptiness to a large degree, Because if you recall what's going on, I hope I'm not ruining the movie for anybody who hasn't seen it, but there's this Neo, and he's going through his life and he's having this experience, and he finds out that actually what is occurring is all within what they call the matrix. It's all like a world that has been created through computer technology, and his actual mind and body are somewhere else. They're not there in that physical world. He's having this kind of experience through the matrix. That's very mind only, in my estimation, because there still is a mind that is having this experience, but the appearance of it being an external world that one is going about in and doing all these activities is an illusion. For the mind only school, this is their main object of negation in terms of being able to develop one's mind into Buddhahood. What is keeping you from being a Buddha is that belief that things in our external world have that external reality. What Chitta mind only says is that every karmic seed creates an imprint on our mind that causes two things to arise. It causes the external appearance of, at this moment, for example, the computer that's appearing before you and me inside the computer, the image of me and doing all these things, saying all these things. And then you have the conscious awareness of that. That is the second part of it. You have these two elements from every karmic seed: an objective experience that seems to be external to the mind, and a subjective experience that is happening at the exact same moment. Now, even the middle way schools will attribute some level of what's going on to karma. Karma is a key teaching throughout all of Buddhism. We do have, even in the middle way school, what we call our karmic appearances. But nonetheless, for the middle way schools, things still do have an external reality. That is, except for one sub-school of Svatantrika, but I'm not going to go there. Anyway, most of the middle way adherents will say that there is external reality. The computer that is in front of you that you can point to and, put your finger on the screen, there is that external object. They get into a deeper way in which that external object is posited. For Chitta Mantra, though, they say that that is an illusion, that external object is there. Its externality, its externalness is not true, because that object is arising from the same karmic seed that causes a subjective awareness to arise. This is their view of what they mean by mind only. They're not saying, in essence, that it's all just mind, but that there is an inseparability of the objective awareness of something appearing to be external and the subjective awareness of that. And so this is how they are looking at reality. And they're doing a much deeper investigation. And by the way, this isn't just something that somebody, who was smoking something, decided that they would start believing in. This is actually in one of the sutras of the Buddha, several of the sutras of the Buddha, that third wheel turning. Remember, I talked about how there are three turnings of the wheel of Dharma. In the third wheel turning, the Buddha said that things don't have this external existence. And this was one way of helping people to move away from the attachment that we have to our external world. Now, whether this is actually true or not, it seems that most people in the Golokpa camp will look at it and say, this isn't really an absolute truth, because even though once more karma is involved in our appearances, we still will establish that there are external objects that arise from their causes and conditions and so on. They don't deny the existence of the external world. Nonetheless, they will question, how does that external world actually exist? That's what we're going to look at shortly with the middle way schools. But with mind only, they are definitely saying that external world is an illusion. It's not just like a dream, it is very much a dream. It appears to have its reality, but just as when we wake up from our dreams, those things don't exist, so too when we come to realize emptiness or selflessness in their school, we will no longer have this kind of conviction that things have that external existence. That appearance will eventually be eliminated. So this is a very unique view. The Chitta school, as I was saying, is a way to help us to let go of the strong attachment that we have to the external world. And as such, it can be a very valuable tool for us to study and meditate on. It's not to be confused with, again, the final way that things exist, the highest point of view according to Buddhist philosophy, and at least in the Geluk presentation, this presentation of Tibetan Buddhism. but can be very helpful for people, to come to let go of our strong attachment to that. So again, the definition for the two truths for this school isn't really that of enlightening. There are different ones that are put forward. But essentially, we are talking about something that can be known as we move into the higher schools. We're mainly looking at something that can be known by an ultimate awareness, which is when we are in deep meditation and seeing things as they are. For Chittamatra, that means seeing that things that appear external do not have that existence at all. And there are things that are conventionally posited, which means by just our everyday awareness is establishing this is this, that is that, and what have you. And this is kind of the formula going forward. I do want to show one set of slides that have to do with the two truths. This is kind of our agenda for tonight. I don't need to necessarily review it so much. We've already started looking at Chittamatra, and then we're going to go on to Madhyamaka, and then look at a little bit of a concluding words and advice for study and practice. But regarding the two truths, I want to share a quote from Guy Newland's book that I've been using heavily for this and that I usually use when I talk about this subject. He says it's critical to keep in mind that conventional truths and ultimate truths are not two types of viewpoint or perspective on the world, nor two levels of reality, nor, as one might naturally expect, even two types of truth, because we see that conventional truths are often quite deceptive, right? Rather, they are objects that exist and can be known, and thus encompass all objects of knowledge. And this is true really for all four of the schools, but becomes even more relevant as we move into these Mahayana schools, Chittamatra and Madhyamika. By asserting that objects of knowledge are the basis of division of the two truths, Gelugpa teachers make the point that the two truths are knowable, accessible to understanding. Thus, the two truths are two types of things that we can know and that we should aspire to know. So that again gives us at least the orientation that we're especially holding on to as we move into the higher schools, that they have equal validity, these two categories of phenomena. Of course, ultimate truths, and as we get into these higher schools, are things that we are quite blind to, because the higher schools are always positing ultimate truths to be equivalent to the deeper awareness of things, how they exist, that is currently not accessible by us, but can be accessible. And once more, as Satrantika was pointing out, through a process of working with our conceptuality. So in the same way that we're, talking about knowing that subtle selflessness of persons that I had on the screen a short while ago, that the person cannot be a self-sufficient, substantially existent phenomenon, we also would do the same with regard to what Chittamatra posits, come to understand through our reasoning and awareness that this appearance of things being external is fiction, and know the deeper way that Chittamatra posits things existing free of that. Again, arising from this kind of, they call it a bakchak in Tibet, this imprint on the mind that gives rise to this dualistic appearance of there being an external world that's being known and the internal consciousness that is knowing it. So that's when we get into their version of what they mean by conventional truth or ultimate truth. It has to do with that duality. Let me put that on the screen. Go back to the chart that we have here on the two truths. So it says for Chittamatra, this is the conventional truth column, that which is realized by means of a valid direct perceiver that realizes it clearly with dualistic appearance. And that is any object except their view of emptiness, their selflessness. Whereas ultimate truth is that which is realized by means of a valid direct perceiver that realizes it clearly without dualistic appearance. That subject and object illusion that is going on, the external world that is known by the internal knower. And the example there is an emptiness that is a form, and its form apprehending valid cognizer's emptiness of being other substances. That's a very complicated way to talk about, again, how the external form that is being known and the valid cognizer knowing it are not different substances. They're arising from that same bakchak, that same karmic imprint. I'm not going to get into the second view of their emptiness. In the handout, it talks about two ways that they could look at how things are lacking a way of existing. But the main one to focus on here is that things do not have a separate external existence apart from the consciousness that is knowing them. So again, you have that imprint giving rise to that. And that's what this sutra, it's again, Sutra Unraveling the Thought is the main sutra that teaches this, that the Buddha taught this. And even there's this whole school, philosophical school, that was built on that idea that really what is happening is all within the mind. The mind having that appearance of an external object that is being known and the internal awareness that is knowing it. So anything that is known in that way can be posited as a conventional truth, but the recognition of the lack of that way of existing as something external to the mind is an ultimate truth. So this is again beginning to move into ultimate truth being much more clearly delineated as a view of emptiness. And that's why ultimate makes sense there. It's the final view of things. Whereas on a conventional level, things do still have their own conventional mode of existing. Now, there's another teaching that is in your handout that has to do with what are called the three natures. And I'm going to just do a very basic explanation of them because otherwise we'll get bogged down in this to some degree. But Chittamatra does definitely teach that there are three natures to things, and we could translate these in the middle way school and kind of understand them in a slightly different way. But what they say is there are first what are called other-powered phenomena. Other-powered phenomena are all of these various things that arise from causes and conditions. So we could say that this mala that I'm holding in my hand has its nature as an other-powered phenomena arising from all the various causes and conditions that brought about its existence. We then have also what are called imaginary natures. This is a second one. The most important imaginary nature is the false imaginary nature that we think that this exists out here external to the mind. Again, for Chittamatra, that's the error that we're all making and that we're all subject to until we realize their view of emptiness. So we can say that with this other powered phenomenon that is this mala that's in my hand, there is also the imaginary nature of it having its own external existence apart from the subjective awareness as a different substance. Rather, again, as we understand through its view of emptiness, it arises from that imprint that is giving rise to both the subjective awareness and the external appearance. The third nature is its emptiness. It's called its thoroughly established nature is the words that they used for it. And that means that in the end, this mala is empty of existing in the way that I was just talking about as an external phenomenon that is a different substance from the mind that is knowing it. So these three natures, that's the simplest way to talk about them is just to apply them to any phenomenon. There are some existent imaginary natures, which are those things that are conceived by the mind, that are kind of in the category of what Sautrantika was calling their conventional truths, those things that are conceptualized, and so on. So we have the permanent phenomena included in conventional kind of awareness, and by virtue of that, you do have existent imaginaries. But the most important imaginary phenomenon that we have, or imaginary nature, is that false way that we are holding things to exist. So again, we're kind of like Neo in the Matrix, kind of seeing a world arising all around us that is really just a creation of imprints on our own mind. And that's a false view. When we come to see that for what it is, it's like we've taken the red pill, I think it's the red pill, right? That causes them to go down and, be released from this illusion. Of course, there's still a real world going on underneath the illusion. That's where it's not quite in the view of emptiness either, because there's no real questioning of that. But what was going on in terms of this false appearance is very similar in my mind to what happens in the mind-only point of view. Again, there's many other pages where you can read in your handout. Hopefully some of you have even read through some of that. I know some of the terminology might start sounding a little confusing. I might just give a shout out once more to the book Appearance and Reality, which is what I've been using as the main source for a lot of the passages that I've shared with you. If you want to explore this topic in a little more detail, it's very tough going at times, but I like Guy Newland's explanations of things because he really does help to kind of keep it really something we can get our heads around, hopefully, at least most of it. So this is the next kind of way of moving away from our concretizing of reality, is to begin to question, how does this external world exist? Now, as we get into the middle way, it's not just the external world that we're going to question. It becomes a matter of questioning all phenomena, everything that exists, even subjective awarenesses. When the
Okay,
middle when the middle way school, oops, your microphone's on, Shayla.
I apologize.
It's okay. Um, so when we get into the middle way schools, they will actually look at Chittamatra, and one of the main faults that they ascribe to Chittamatra is that they don't go far enough in examining the nature of consciousness. Yes, they begin to examine the physical world around them and this appearance of a world, and is that true or not? But they don't go so far to examine consciousness itself. Now, again, there may be people who are actually practicing some of these philosophical points of view in our day and age as Buddhists, and I can't speak to what it is that they actually hold or how they look at things or how they establish phenomena. This is a very set kind of textual way of looking at it from the vantage point of Tibetan Buddhism, looking back on Indian Buddhism and all that the Buddha taught and ascribing particular points of view. And some of these don't even have people who are practitioners of these schools in our modern day. So it's very hard to say how correct all of these are. But the middle way schools definitely find fault with what is going on with Chittamatra and saying, you haven't gone far enough in terms of looking at consciousness and what the nature of that is and how it exists. Moreover, they say that you've gone too far by denying the external existence of things. So remember how last week I talked about how you often have these two extremes. You have an extreme of what we call permanence, where we are holding on to things to exist in a fictitious way and not going far enough in challenging that. Also, we have the extreme of annihilation or non-existence, where we are going too far in negating something. So while each of the schools claims to hold a middle way between these two extremes, only the middle way school seems to have gotten to a point where they can hold a point of view that is really quite solidly between these two. And when they look at all the other schools below them, they can see how they have not found a correct middle way. So for Chittamatra, when the Prasangika Madhyamaka, the highest school, looks at them, they say, oh, you're still holding your extreme of permanence over here because you're still holding the consciousness to have some sort of substantial real existence, whereas you're denying the external world, but you're not going far enough. Secondly, you're annihilating things because you think that there is no external world, but there actually is an external world. How does that external world exist? Well, that's what we're going to be looking at, the two schools of the Madhyamaka, the middle way. So the Madhyamaka schools, again, are divided into, let me put the little chart on there that shows the philosophical schools. So I have to go back up one here. We see that again on the right-hand side there, the middle way schools have the Swatantrika, the autonomy school, and the Prasangika, the consequence school. Again, you might hear these Sanskrit terms pronounced differently by different people. I make no claims to having perfect Sanskrit. I've never studied Sanskrit. Know that the middle way point of view that says there, Nagarjuna and Aryadeva are kind of the main people attributing that, Nagarjuna being primary. This is a point of view that goes back to the second wheel turning. Chittamatra is very much involved in that third wheel turning. But the middle way school relies heavily upon the perfection of wisdom sutras, which were denying a mode of existence that each of these two sub-schools, Swatantrika and Prasangika, defined slightly differently. For Swatantrika, the idea is that they are beginning to question the nature of things, but they are still holding to some level of what we call in the Prasangika school inherent existence. Whereas Prasangika goes all the way to saying there is nothing inherently within any phenomenon that establishes its existence, that kind of establishes how it exists. Things do exist, and all the schools will avoid any kind of annihilation, the view that's kind of going too far, especially in the middle way. We don't go to that place where we say things don't utterly exist at all, but rather things exist in a very, very subtle way, especially when you get to the Prasangika point of view. So let me kind of frame things to get into this discussion of these two schools. Remember how last week I also talked about how not just are these kind of rungs on a ladder, which is the analogy that Guy Newland uses, but my teaching assistant, the teaching assistant, not my teaching assistant, the teaching assistant that I had in the master's program, wonderful teacher, Jumpa Gendon, he used the analogy of this wading into a very deep lake. And the idea, again, I mentioned this last time, that we go further and further in and we let go of some things. But the one thing that we hold on to until we get to the very deepest water is this view of inherent existence. What do we mean by that? We mean that things are able to establish themselves, they have a self nature. Things do have a nature. Green has a different nature than red, right? Or the taste of sugar has a different nature than the taste of uh, salt, right? They have a different nature that can be established through the force of the awareness that is knowing those, but they are not able to establish themselves by way of that nature. They don't have an ability to set themselves up or to even set that nature up. It is always contingent upon an awareness knowing those. In particular, in the consequence school, it is known by an awareness that conceptualizes things, that imputes things. So what we're going to see in these last two schools is kind of the last two steps to let go of that kind of life preserver that we're holding on to, that helps us to get to a point where we let go of it all. And instead of drowning, we actually achieve insight. We actually come to understand exactly how things do exist and not have any delusion present in the mind whatsoever. So if we go back just a little bit to Chittamatra is obviously putting a great deal of attention on the mind and saying that these external appearances are only from the same substance of the mind. They are not, independent of the mind. So in that way, they're almost putting like a 100% on the mind and 0% on things outside, but they're doing it in a very weird way because they're once more giving consciousness some supremacy. They're not going to even question the nature of consciousness to that degree. Prasangika is going to go the furthest in terms of attributing 100% to the mind, but also even attributing that to the way that mind exists. So we're going to see that kind of Prasangika goes the furthest in terms of the degree to which we attribute the existence of things to the mind. So Tantrika is kind of in the middle. So Tantrika is pointing to a 50-50 deal. For Svatantrika, what is happening is that things do have some inherent nature, or else they couldn't be known as what they are. But that depends upon a consciousness that is unmistakably knowing them. They're kind of a 50-50 thing. And if we look at it, this is probably where most of us are at. Even in our own study of the Prasangika, we might still think that there's got to be something there that makes red red and green green, or else it would all become just pea soup and we wouldn't be able to differentiate anything. It would all become kind of the same nature. Well, things do still have the marks that delineate them, but those once more are dependent upon the consciousness designating this is red, this is green. There's no greenness or redness from the side of the object. Svatantrika is a very important one to study because it gets to the object of negation even more clearly for the Prasangika point of view, or this final point of view. What we are holding on to, that life preserver, as we go deeper and deeper, is inherent existence, meaning something has something from its own side that identifies what it is. In Prasangika, it is 100% on the mind, but even mind lacks that way of existing, independent of the mind. It too depends upon mind. Everything depends upon the mind conceptualizing. This is this thought, this is that color, this is this mind, this is that body, this is whatever. So this is what we're going to be heading into. I'm just kind of framing things a little bit before we actually do the deeper work. So let's go to the slides. I want to introduce the idea of what we are looking at in terms of this object of negation, what it is that we're trying to be free of when it comes to the view of selflessness or emptiness, regarding what they call true existence. Now, Prasangika is going to equate true existence to inherent existence, so don't let it confuse you. This is the term that they use to refer to this way of existing that we falsely adhere to that doesn't exist at all. Okay? So what they say for Svatantrika, this is actually from one of the review classes that we did when I studied this topic in the master's program. For Svatantrika, anything that exists must be posited by the force of a non-defective awareness. Okay, so you do have to have a involvement of consciousness, a consciousness that is knowing things in a non-defective way. In other words, it's not subject to some sort of fault that is temporary or what have you. It is a conceptual mind or a direct perception that is knowing things and can establish them. If something were able to be posited by way of its own uncommon mode of subsistence without the force of appearing to a non-defective awareness, it would be truly existent. That is the measure of true existence in this school. So what do they say? Okay. They are saying that if you posit that it has its nature over here on its own, independent of a mind validating it, then you have true existence. It has to be both. You have to have kind of the mark from the side of the object and the consciousness that is establishing it in a non-defective way. When you have this 50-50 deal, something from the side of the object that makes it red or green or salty or sugary or whatever sweet, then you have the consciousness that validates that. But we can't talk about it having its own established mode of existence or subsistence apart from that. But nonetheless, there's an inherent mark that is known. The inherent mark of red that is known by a valid eye consciousness that is non-defective, that establishes what is red. And then you have what is green that has its own mark of greenness that is then known through the valid eye consciousness that knows green. And the same for salty and sweet being known by the taste consciousness and so on, or even things known by our conceptual awareness. So they do say that there is a dependence upon mind, but things are not merely designated by the mind. They rather have an inherent mark that is then known by the mind. This is a hard one to get our heads around, but if we think about it, as I was saying a few minutes ago, this is actually how we often are thinking of reality. Even when we've begun to study the Prasangika point of view, we still think that there's got to be something from the side of the object that makes it what it is. Some, again, inherent mark, something that exists from the side of the object. Again, to contrast this with Prasangika, Prasangika is going to say, from the side of the object, there is nothing that establishes what it is. It is purely from the mind that is designating and imputing that. That's pretty revolutionary. That's pretty out there, if you think about it, because it's saying again that there's this world that we are involved in. Yes, things can be identified as having a mark of being green or a mark of being red, but that is purely coming from our minds. There's nothing objectively establishing that as red or green. Okay, so this is what we're moving into. Svatantrika is an interesting school because it does help us to get our heads around exactly what it is that we are tending to adhere to, that we are driven by and have desire and anger and everything on the basis of, that one little bit of extra inherent existence. So we went on in the master's program notes to talk about this. It says, we spoke previously about where the power of bringing forth an object's existence lies. This is at the crux, especially of these higher schools. But in the two lower schools, objects exist independent of the mind, right? I mean, whether or not it's known by for Satrantika, whether it's known by a direct perceiver or a conceptual mind, still it has an independent existence. And for Vaibhashika, it certainly has an independent existence as the partless particles or the conglomeration of those. In Svatantrika, now as we move into the middle way, objects do have their own nature, right, as red, green, whatever. But it is only through appearing to a non-defective awareness that the object comes into being. So again, there is an inherent nature of being red or green for them, but only can that be established as existing when it appears to a non-defective awareness. Again, it's kind of it's in between. It's getting us as a bridge to get to the final point of view where we say there's nothing from the side of the object that establishes its own nature. That nature can be established through the force of the consciousness knowing it, but it's not established from the side of the object. In Svatantrika, just to reiterate, objects do have their own nature. They do have an inherent nature. But it's only through the force of a consciousness knowing them and those two things coming together that things can be established or posited as existing. And it says this will be exemplified by the magician's illusion, which is discussed extensively in the next section of the text that we were studying, the middle way text. In that example, there's an appearance of a horse and elephant emerging from the basis of conjuring, the stick and the pebble, but that is not enough for them to exist, right? There must be the positing by the force of appearing to awareness. So existence is contingent upon the subject and not just the object. Without the perceiving consciousness, it is only a matter of a potential from the side of the object. So this is what we're going to be talking about. I'm going to introduce you very briefly to this idea of the magician's illusion, this analogy that's used. It's kind of a tough one. But the idea is there's something from the side of the object, again, that is its greenness or redness or saltiness, sweetness, and then there is the consciousness knowing that. And when those two come together, that's how things can be established as existing. That's what they mean by, again, how things exist conventionally. But we think that things have an ability to be established without the force of appearing to a consciousness. That's the true existence that needs to be refuted. So what are we talking about with this illusion of the magician casting a spell on an audience? I've never been at such an event, but apparently in classic India, they would have these abilities through a salve and a mantra to be able to transform two ordinary objects like a pebble and a stick into the appearance of a horse and an elephant. So there's the basis having a potential, meaning the stick and the pebble, to be able to give rise to that appearance. But it's contingent upon the mantra being said to a room full of people who are gathered there to see the illusion, as well as the application of some sort of salve or whatever that causes this false appearance. So there's kind of, again, the potential within the pebble and stick to be able to give rise to this false appearance, but it's contingent upon the audience being having this awareness that is then being able to see this, which is, of course, a mistaken awareness, a defective awareness, because this is all an illusion. There is no real elephant or horse in the room, but it's used as an analogy. So when the audience is seeing this illusion, they're all there and the horse and the elephant are appearing. They might even get kind of scared. Oh my gosh, there's an elephant in the middle of the room, might trample me, or the horse might, buck and suddenly, trample me with its feet or whatever. So there might even be other emotions that arise. That's because the audience believes that the illusion is real, that it kind of exists, again, with its own mode of subsistence. Whereas it is dependent upon those two factors coming together. Its mode of subsistence being known by a valid awareness, a non-defective awareness. For the magician, because the magician knows what's going on, they compare that to somebody who already has an awareness of this view of emptiness, who has already refuted true existence, because they can see that there's an appearance of like this, but they know it's not real. They know it doesn't have that level of reality. And they even point out a latecomer who might come in and not have the salve or the mantra experience. And so they just see a pebble and a stick there on the table, and they don't have the appearance of the horse and elephant at all. The idea is that when you are talking about this analogy, you have these two components. Something doesn't have an ability to be the horse and elephant from its own side. It is the horse and the elephant by virtue of the consciousness that is knowing it in a manner that establishes it. You have those two things kind of coming together. Without that, you cannot have the appearance of that, even though the potential is there. So they talk about this inherent existence as kind of like the potential that everything has to appear as what it is. So green has an inherent potential to be green, red to be red, and so on. But it's only through the force of the awareness that is perceiving it that will then establish that greenness or redness. But nonetheless, still something from the side of the object. I know for those of you who've been primarily indoctrinated into the Prasangika point of view, it sounds close, but it's not quite there, right? Because we are still attributing to the side of the object something that can be posited as what it is. In this case, the horseness or elephantness, which are there only through the force of the consciousness knowing them. They don't exist on their own. The analogy is a little tricky because once more it's using this stone and this pebble and stick and saying that they have the potential to transform into a horse and elephant. It's not quite the same as what we see in our everyday world, where we have red and green existing as the inherent nature of things, and those being known by a valid eye consciousness that sees red and green and so on. But nonetheless, it's a way of pointing out how we can be adhering to, according to this school, Svatantrika school, that we can be adhering to something as having a mode of existing that's independent of the mind. Here, it's 50-50. When the mind is knowing it in a correct way and the object is there to be known with its inherent nature as what it is, then we have the awareness of that. We can establish the existence of that. So it's giving a bit more onus to the mind, and it would say the same with regard to mind. It would say the same in regard to any phenomenon, that everything is dependent upon those two factors coming together. I think we do have one passage I wanted to share. Let me find this in our handout where we talk about Svatantrika. One thing I didn't do when I was on Mind Only, but you can go back and take a look at that, was talk about this, their object of refutation. I talked about it, but there is a nice little passage on that. Okay, let me go to page 9 of that, what I was wanting to point out. Okay, so pulling this back up, whoops, that's here. We go to this, to page 9. So again, there's quite a few pages that I've skipped over in here. Hopefully you can go back and kind of fill in some gaps. Whoops, went too far. Okay, so at the bottom of page 9, we see this little paragraph that starts here. Thus, for the Svatantrikas, two factors are essential. The first is the objective mode of subsistence of the object, which exists from the object's own side, but does not exist independently. It doesn't have that kind of ability to stand on its own completely. If it did, it would be an extreme of permanence. It would have that true existence that this school is refuting. This mode of subsistence is posited by appearing to a non-defective consciousness, which is either conceptual or non-conceptual. For them, they give equal power to our sensory perceptions as well as our conceptual mind in establishing what exists and what doesn't exist. Phenomena gain their entities through the power of the awareness to which they appear. However, such consciousnesses do not subjectively impute those phenomena without any objective basis, since that would be an extreme of annihilation. They rather more passively posit that which already appears to them. So this is how they still hold on to kind of things having an inherent nature. Because once more, all the schools below Prasangika Madhyamaka say things have something from their side that establishes what they are. The greenness, the redness, the sweetness, the sourness, the saltiness, whatever. All of those things have an inherent mark, but they don't exist for Svatantrika independent of the consciousness that knows them, that becomes aware of them, that establishes them. It's a nice little kind of bridge to get us to Prasangika because it will point out exactly what it is that we need to let go of. We need to let go of the fact that things have something over here established on their own. They don't have that for Prasangika. They never have, and they never will. Rather, once more, everything is established through the force of our conceptual mind. That is, knowing things validly through imputation, designation, what have you. So this is an important point in terms of what Svatantrika is holding to. Now, the magician's illusion may not get it completely for you. It doesn't even do it for me all the time. When I look at it, this time when I prepared for it, I had particular problems with it, but it's not the perfect analogy. As it says here, objects have their own mode of being for Svatantrika, in that it is not the mind that determines what it is, and yet objects do not exist without being posited or certified by an awareness. So this is that kind of middle way that they found, that they're kind of finding this ability to hold that things do have an objective mode of existence, subsistence, but they have to be posited by an awareness in order for them to exist. Now, let's start our bridge into inherent existence. This is the object of negation for Prasangika, because once more, they're going to go one step further. Prasangika finds fault with this tenet system, meaning Svatantrika, in regard to this assertion. In Prasangika, there's no mode of existence that is not posited by the mind. Everything is posited by conceptual consciousness. This is once more, Prasangika goes to the point of giving 100% to the mind, but that's true with regard to even the mind itself. There is no phenomenon that does not exist that is not posited by the mind. If we compared the magician's illusion to the illustrative image used in Prasangika, a coiled striped rope mistaken for a snake, we can see the main difference, that the coiled rope doesn't have the potential to be seen as a snake from the side of the object, the rope, whereas the pebble and stone do have the potential, as I pointed out when I explained Svatantrika. However, the objects in the magician's illusion, the pebble and stick, do have a potential residing in them to be seen as a horse and elephant due to mantra, or to the salve that's applied, or whatever it is that they use to create that illusion. So this is a fine point. Let's talk about this analogy that was just mentioned. That's the Prasangika one, because this one is kind of mind-blowing, I think. So Kappa puts this forward, and he, gives it great importance in his text. Imagine that it's kind of a dusk time, where it's somewhat dark, and you have an appearance to you as you're walking outside of what seems to be a snake, but it's actually a piece of coiled rope. Maybe it's even striped so that it has this, kind of, it looks like it's got the markings of a snake. And maybe you've even had something similar happen where it's been due to the light or due to some sort of trick to the eye, where you saw something that you thought was actually kind of an object that it wasn't. So there's an ability very quickly, of course, with a flashlight or whatever, or looking a little bit closer, to negate that, to know that on the basis of what is just a coiled rope, there's no snake at all. Okay. So in this case, from what's on the side of the coiled rope, we cannot find anything that gives rise to snakeness. This is purely an illusion from our side of calling that a snake, distinguishing that as a snake. But this is how actually everything that does exist as a snake, or as the color red, or as the color green, or whatever it is that we are positing, how it actually does exist. There's nothing from the side of the base that is the object that we are designating. We are designating snake to the collection of parts that we correctly designate snake to. Let's not talk about the coiled rope any longer. When we have what's in front of us that is actually a snake, say you go to the zoo and you go to the reptile house and you see that coiled flesh with all the markings and what have you, with the little head and the tail that come, or the tongue that comes out and what have you. Well, then you have a correct basis for snake. But in the same way that snake there's nothing you can find that is snake on the coiled rope, there's nothing you can find on the parts of a snake that are the snake. There is nothing from the side of the object that establishes what it is. Now, of course, how do you prove that? You do the investigation. Now, I gave you two little meditations to do on the coarser views of selflessness. For, of course, this school, what we want to do is go investigating to see if we can find that inherently existent snake, that snake that exists on the parts of a snake, that is out there established on its own. For Prasangika, this is the illusion, that things have their own nature, that they establish themselves, that they exist by way of that. Now, again, we have a nature that can be imputed on that. There's a difference between a coiled rope and a snake. They have two different natures. But those natures are not from the side of the object. Those natures are from the side of our conceptual consciousness that is designating one as a snake and one as a coiled rope. But in the mistaken view, we think that there's a real snake on the parts of a snake. We think that there's a real coiled rope on the part of the coiled rope. And this is identical to this, a way that we would impute snake on a coiled rope, when there's nothing from the side of the coiled rope that makes it a snake. There's also nothing from the side of the parts of the snake that make it a snake, nothing from the side of the coiled rope that makes it a coiled rope. Or I should say the parts of a coiled rope. So in this school, we have what are called the basis of imputation, which is the phenomenon that appears to us that then is designated or imputed as the phenomenon that we establish it as. So when you see the parts of a snake that are slithering through the grass or whatever, then you are correctly imputing in that case snake to it, but there's nothing from the side of that slithering thing through the grass that makes it a snake. And whereas, of course, if you impute snake onto a coiled rope, there's nothing from the side of the rope that is even a snake conventionally. It does have a conventional existence. And that's what Prasangika means by conventional truth, is something that can be posited through the correct, valid imputation of a conceptual consciousness. When we conceive of this as being a snake, this as being a coiled rope, and so on. There's nothing from the side of that basis that makes it the object that we are imputing to it. So we go investigating, kind of withholding that view of something being real there that is a snake. And where do we look? We look on the basis and see, is there something actually there that is established as snake from its own side? We find that it doesn't exist in that manner. I think most of you are familiar with the four-fold analysis, four-point analysis. We bring to mind that false appearance, that way that things do seem to exist on their own, setting themselves up, self-existent, objectively existent. Again, different ways of describing this. And then we establish, well, what are the possibilities for where we would find that? Because if it does exist, it should be findable. If there's a real snake out there on the parts of a snake, we should be able to find it, right? If there's, a real color red on the basis of what we see and posit as red, we should be able to find it. Again, we do find what appears as red and is designated as red, but nonetheless, it doesn't have any redness from its own side. That is a concept that we put on red, just like snake is a concept we put on the coiled body of a being that, has the conventional agreement that we're going to call that a snake. So Prasangika Madhyamaka, when it comes to the two truths and how they look at them, they're very much still in this camp, as we saw earlier by looking at Sautrantika, that it's dependent upon the consciousness that is knowing them. An ordinary, everyday, worldly consciousness establishes conventional existence. It says, oh, this is barley, and this is corn, and this is rice, and this is, light, and this is dark, and whatever else that we posit. That's perfectly fine. And the Buddha doesn't take issue with the world and how it defines and describes and imputes the world around us. An ultimate valid cognition, which is eventually the direct mind that knows emptiness in a non-dualistic way, is what's going to posit the true nature of things, the ultimate truths. So here, once more, these higher schools are very much about ultimate truth being what we know through our ultimate analytical mind that is looking to see, do things withstand analysis? If we go looking for what is actually there, will we find it? It should be findable if it exists in the way that it appears, because everything appears to us as if it did have its own mode of subsistence in this prasangika way, being able to set itself up as what it appears, as blue, as red, as whatever, snake, as coiled rope. So let me share a few more things on this. Let's go back to the slides. I'm sorry, no, not the slides. Let's go to the charts. So we see again for Madhyamaka Svatantrika, we have this kind of still being input the dualistic appearance there. For Prasangika, we go to this idea of conventional truth being an object which is found by a valid cognizer, meaning a valid mind, knowing, distinguishing a conventionality. And this is the tricky part. And with respect to which a valid cognizer distinguishing a conventionality becomes a valid cognizer distinguishing conventionality. I'm just going to mention why that's added in there. It is in your notes that I provided you, the handout. It has to do with a Buddha. A Buddha's mind knows both conventional truth and ultimate truth simultaneously. So we have to include the fact that it's knowing it in a manner that it establishes a conventionality, not just in a manner of the way a Buddha knows things, which is knowing things by an omniscient mind. Anyway, don't worry so much about that. The main part of it is the beginning. It's found by a valid cognizer distinguishing a conventionality, saying again, this is barley, this is wheat, this is rice, this is corn. An object which is found by a valid cognizer analyzing for the final mode of existence is a object that is an ultimate truth. That's where we actually go analyzing and we find the emptiness of a phenomenon. Ultimate truths are emptinesses. Conventional truths are everything else that appears to be real from its own side, but is not. And so those phenomena do have definitely this kind of concealed nature. They appear in one way, but are known in another. There's so much more I wanted to say in the course of this, and we're running out of time. Let me go back to the slides because I do think there are a few things there that I want to make sure I share before we go too far. The lower schools, again, besides Prasangika, say that objects exist from their own side, independent of mind. Svatantrika says that objects exist from their own side, but dependent on the mind as well. We saw that tonight, right? Prasangika is the last one we looked at, which again, most of us should be quite familiar with because that's the view of emptiness that is taught all the time in our schools. Prasangika say objects do not exist at all from their own side, but exist merely in dependence on the mind. So you can see this idea of kind of moving further out, going into deeper and deeper water. And what we are holding on to is inherent existence. The lower schools don't question the nature of things quite as much. They do question the nature of the person, the self. And remember those two coarser views of the self, one that's the coarsest, and then of course the subtler one that all the other schools say is what you have to abandon to attain liberation. It is only Prasangika Madhyamaka that says you have to go even further than that. For them, that's a coarse view. You have to actually examine the inherent existence of the I, of the self. And you have to come to see that that does not exist. There is no real I here. There's only this idea, concept of I that is imputed on this basis of the mind and the body. That's the root of samsara. That's the root of all of our problems. And that is also something that needs to be abandoned then to attain Buddhahood. So whether you're attaining Buddhahood or attaining your own liberation, you need to realize this final way of establishing emptiness, that it is being empty of being inherently existent, existing from its own side, having any mode of subsistence that is independent of the mind, imputing it. Okay. We finish off the slides here because there's some nice advice for realizing emptiness that comes from Khenpo Sultram. I had a quote from him, I think, last week that I found in this one interesting book about tenets. That's not the ideal book in my estimation, but nonetheless an interesting one. The purpose of contemplating the teachings is to develop certainty about what the meaning of emptiness really is. You have doubts, for example, and by working with those doubts, you come to a kind of clarity when they disappear. This is the whole point of our practice and study, really, and even attending something like this, is to see where we may have the ability to examine our doubts, examine what it is that keeps us holding on to that life preserver of inherent existence, and letting more and more go. It may take some time to see, I do not really understand this, or I'm not sure of this. So you examine these doubts, these places where it seems foggy, and gradually you come to a really clear picture to yourself of what emptiness is. Then, with the clear conviction, this is emptiness, you meditate, resting with that certainty. You meditate settled into the conviction that you have generated through reflecting on the meaning of emptiness. Right? And that's what actually gets you there. That's what actually will, allow you to eventually have that realization. So I hope this has been helpful. We'll see if there are questions in a moment. But again, we've looked at in some coarser views that are worthwhile as stepping stones, as ways to go further and further, deeper and deeper, and to come to see really how far Prasangika goes. It's pretty revolutionary. But the whole point of this is to help you to overcome the doubts, to begin to see more clearly what it is that maybe you're still holding on to. I remember, let me say one more comment, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who many of you have met, and we're still awaiting his reincarnation to be identified and what have you. But at one teaching, he said that he went to one of his teachers, I think it was Trijang Rinpoche, and he said, this is what I'm trying to negate. Is this correct? Is this the right object of negation? And he actually pointed out to him, this is what Rinpoche said. Of course, again, it's probably just a lesson for us mere mortals, but he said that his teacher told him that he was actually holding on to the Svatandrika point of view. He wasn't going far enough in what he was negating. So again, we have to be very, very clear about what it is that we are trying to realize, the selflessness that we need to establish through our reasoning, through our analysis. And then through that will help us to establish the two truths. And when you attain Buddhahood, then, as was explained just a few minutes ago, you know the two truths, in a single moment of mind. You have a mind that knows all of reality. That's what we're aiming for. So, okay. Any questions, comments, criticisms?
Yeah.
Yes, please, Lorna.
So, this has been really helpful, Dawn. Really, really helpful. Thank you
Oh,
so
good.
much.
Good. Good hearing that.
So it gets me thinking back to the example of a color, like the color red.
Mhm,
And the Sanchrantikas will say that that color red has its own nature from its own side
mhm,
that is perceived by a mind.
mhm,
But there isn't just one color of red. Like I just think of the shirt I used to have, and I always thought it was green. And when a friend said, "Oh, I really like your shirt. What a pretty color of blue," it kind of blew my mind because this isn't blue, it's green. So I was just thinking that, once again, that to me sort of actually proves the emptiness of a color having it's a nature from its own side, because everybody's going to see that color differently.
mhm,
Like there's no such thing as a true one tone of green that everybody's going to agree with and say, yes, that's the same green. We all see it. When some people see blue in it, some people will see yellow in it.
right.
And so to me, that kind of always brings me back to the emptiness of that it does not have a nature from its
Mhm,
own side if
mhm.
everybody sees it differently.
Absolutely. It's interesting. I think you mentioned the Nova show last week, didn't you? And there was
Yeah,
one that was, I don't
yeah,
know if it
the
was
atom.
Nova or one of those that talked about
Yeah,
visual perception. And they used that some of you may have seen that on the internet when there was a dress that some people saw as black and gold and other people saw as blue and green or something. I don't know. It was a really weird optical illusion. And these things, again, get to the subjective involvement in what is appearing to us. And color is an interesting one because, of course, what is really appearing to us is, again, as we know through science, the light that has all of the colors in the spectrum, and what is actually being reflected back to us it's an illusion in and of itself, in terms of there's no real red out there that I can identify. But what you're pointing out, Lorna, is also a part of it, that it can appear very, very different to different people depending upon their own perception, their own. And look at people who are color blind. My gosh, you can talk about red or green to them, but they're not the
I
appearance of
don't
red
know.
or green that we might have, or that people who normally, or normal isn't the best word, people who more collectively identify as red or green. There's different perceptions. And so this becomes, again, signals that point us towards that primacy of the mind and the establishment of things through our consciousness. Now, again, I got into an argument one night with one student. I don't know if it was quite an argument, but there certainly was a bit of a disagreement, because oftentimes in the Satrantika school, the earlier one, they point to like a blue snow mountain as being the example of where you have a defective eye consciousness, and due to the fact that you have a different color that is appearing based on the time of day. During the daylight, when you look up at a snow mountain, as you might do in Denver or any of these places where you have all the mountainous snow up there, it looks white in the middle of the day. But at certain times of day, it might look pink, or it might look blue, it might look very different. Well, they say that this is a defective awareness because it's not knowing things as they are. But this person was arguing me and saying, but even when it's a white snow mountain during the day, it's not being known in the way that it is. And I don't know. I mean, I don't want to go too far in some of these things. And Buddhism is not trying to concretize reality so much. And certainly when you get to Prasangika, there's not a concretizing of it at all. And as we're pointing out, there's very much a subjective involvement in what is established. Nonetheless, we have some conventional agreement. We might all look to the snow mountain and identify it as generally being white because that's our general experience of whiteness that we see through the force of all of this. It's the illusion that's going on. So we can still posit some level of conventional existence. Nonetheless, there will be variances on that. There will be differences on that. And
Well, the
this,
concept of an optical illusion itself
yeah,
points you to emptiness, right?
Yeah,
When
I
you
think
think
so.
about it.
I think so. Yeah. One of my Facebook friends has been posting a lot of those, they called them magic eye things, where you see the 3D thing coming out of, if you look at it in a particular way, what looks like just as blotches of color, a 3D image appears. Those are kind of interesting. I don't know what the Buddha would have said about those, but you know, the, all of these things, I think, are signs pointing us to that reality, that what is perceived is in the eye of the perceiver and not
That's right.
objectively out there. And so
Yeah,
we're not establishing, again, that objective reality is anyone can make anything out of anything. That would be an extreme for Prasangika, is that there still are things we can establish as this is this, that is that.
yeah,
But we're doing that in the same manner that we establish everything. It's only established through the force of our imputing consciousness. There's no mark from the side of the object that establishes it as that. Only our conceptual mind that says, okay, this is what we're going to designate as red. This is what we're going to designate as green, sweet, as salty, whatever. Nothing from the side of the object at all. But I think it's hard to get to that. It is still, even though we do have these examples.
Well,
Mm.
definitely food for thought.
Color for thought. Lots of things for thought. Any other comments? Thanks, Lorna. That was good. Again, I wish I could remember if I think it was a Nova that had to do with visual perception. Kind of interesting to watch because it does make you question a lot of things. Okay. So again, I apologize that I'm trying to fit so much into just 2 sessions, but the notes are there, and maybe you can gain some appreciation for some of the things that are behind the scenes that I didn't get a chance to talk about quite as much. And certainly, again, Guy Newland's book is an excellent tool to use. At some point, if you haven't done the full tenets course, I would certainly recommend it. It's one of the standard texts in the basic program. I have heard that there's something happening around basic program for next year, that I know we're going to continue doing basic program courses here and there, certainly through the centers that offer it, but there might even be a more coordinated approach to doing the basic program, which is something that's been very much needed in the FPMT, at least for our region and what have you. So keep an eye out for that. I might mention that I am doing a basic program course starting next Thursday for TNL, Buddhist Center. That is one that does require highest yoga tantra empowerment. It is called the Grounds and Paths of Secret Mantra. And if you have any questions about that, certainly ask the folks at TNL. But you do have to have an empowerment into highest yoga tantra, such as the Yamantaka empowerment that was given at TNL in May, at the end of May, beginning of June. But anyway, let me do the dedication prayers. So you get the right thing here. Okay. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. And thinking about our teachers, we'll recite first the prayer for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And as we recite this, think that not only are we making strong prayers for the fulfillment of his wishes and for his long life and good health, but also the same for all of our other gurus who are still with us. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And then we'll recite the prayer for Lama Zopa tonight, dedicating all the merit for his quick return. Peerless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Losang, father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding, I've got something blocking my view there, holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice, you wear the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable Venerable Guru, to you I make request. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and for mother living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss. Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. Let's dedicate finally for those beings we're holding in our hearts, any beings that we know who are suffering in whatever way that might be. We dedicate for them, sending this positive energy out to them so they receive the benefit of it, have their suffering removed immediately, and find all the causes that lead them to true peace and happiness. And may this be so for all beings, so what we have done here tonight. I might mention that I will post online in that same folder the meditation on the fourfold analysis. Those of you who maybe don't have that, so that you can at least work with that. That is the way we come to realize the Prasangika view of emptiness. So at least you have a version of that that you can work with. And I'll also post, of course, the presentation slides from tonight. Okay, thank you all for attending and your patience and dealing with this for these 2 sessions. I will hopefully see you all again sometime soon in person. All right, be well.
Thank you